Hello, we welcome you to the program today. If you would, please turn in your Bibles to Esther chapter 7. We'll be continuing our study of the Book of Esther. Esther chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, we see how Esther revealed Haman's plot in Esther 7, 1 through 6. In verse 1, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. As before, King Ahasuerus and Haman went to a banquet prepared by Queen Esther. Like we see back in Esther chapter 5 and verse 4, and also Esther 5 and verse 8. The banquet was called the Banquet of Wine in Esther chapter 2, 7 and verse 2. The term rendered dine in this passage means to drink. In other instances in the book of Esther, it is translated as drink in Esther 3:15 and Esther 4 and 16. Again, note that the banquet was called the Banquet of Wine in verse 2. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." While at the banquet, the king again asked Queen Esther her petition, Esther 5 and 6, just as he had before. He promised to grant her petition. Whatever she requested, it would be done for her. Esther had prepared the banquets for the pleasure of the king, like we see in Esther 5 and 4 and Esther 5 and 8. The king knew that she had not yet given her actual petition. Yes, she had made a petition that he come to the banquet, and then she did it again, that he come to the banquet. But even the king recognized that that was not her true petition, what she really wanted to ask the king. And so here we see that the king knew, and it becomes clear in the following passages. Verse 3, then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." Here is her true petition. It was now the second banquet, and so Esther would make her petition and request of the king. And as before, Queen Esther spoke respectfully and humbly to King Ahasuerus. She asked the king for her life, and she asked the king for the lives of her people. I note that she asked the king humbly for redemption. The idea of redemption, of offering a ransom being given by the Redeemer in order to set the people free, to buy the people back. And in this case here, she's asking the king for the redemption of her people. If it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Verse 4, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Mordecai had given the man a copy of the written decree for the destruction of the Jews, to show it to Esther so that she could go to the king and make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. We see this in Esther 4 and verse 8. Esther 3 and verse 13. Let's read this passage again. Esther 3 and 13. It says, and the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So there was the decree. Esther told the king that she and her people had been sold by the enemy to be destroyed. In the context, the term sold means, according to Vine's Expository Dictionary, to be given over to death. Remember, Haman is at the banquet with the king and the queen. How his countenance must have changed at this time, and his thoughts troubled him. Think about it. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 6. While Haman knew that Mordecai was a Jew, there's no indication that he knew that Esther was a Jew. Well, he sure knew now. Esther told the king that if she and her people had been sold only as male and female slaves, not to be destroyed, but to be slaves, she would have remained silent and would not have went in before the king to petition him. Even so, if they had been sold as slaves, she said, the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. She may have alluded to how Haman offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury. This is in Esther 3 and 9 and Esther 4 and verse 7. The loss of subjects to the king would be too great for the enemy to offset by money. The loss to the king would be far greater than the taxes paid by the people. Esther did not yet identify Haman by name, but she soon would. The author of the book of Esther called Haman the enemy of the Jews. We see this in Esther 3:10, chapter 8:1, chapter 9:10, and also chapter 9 and verse 24. The enemy of the Jews. In this passage, we see here that she points out that the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Some people think that the word enemy here should be translated as distress. While often translated as enemy, it's true that the word is translated in other places as distress, like Deuteronomy 4:10 or Deuteronomy 4:30, anguish in Job 7:11, and trouble in Job 15 and 24. And some versions reflect this difference. However, while such would provide an explanation of why she would remain silent, certainly such an explanation is not required. And so here we see that this term enemy is foe or adversary. And so here she refers to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Now, in this passage here, she alludes to him by simply saying the enemy in verse 4, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. The enemy is clearly Haman in the passage. However, King Ahasuerus was not yet aware of this, as revealed by his question later, at least in his ignorance to Esther when he asked her the question. Verse 5, King Ahasuerus is highly perturbed. The passage says, so King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? So again, he's highly perturbed. He's upset. His questions to Queen Esther show his agitated state of mind. Who is he? Where is he? Who would dare to be so presumptuous to do such a thing? And so you can almost feel the interrupted thoughts as he as he tries to get him out, to express how he's feeling, his anger, his agitation. Well, let's note briefly the response of the king. We know that the king had given his signet ring to Haman in order to authorize the decree for the destruction of the people who did not keep the commands of the king. And we learned that back in Esther chapter 3, 8 to 11. However, there's no indication in the text that the king knew that the people were the Jews. If we're simply going by what the text reads, there's no indication in the text at this time that he knew that the people to be destroyed were the Jews. From what we know, the king did not ask Haman, and he appears to have given it no further thought. We see that Haman simply tells him that there's a people that are not keeping your commandments, and so the king tells him to do as he thinks is right, and he has his signet ring, and he goes and he uses the signet ring and sends out the decree. Now the king knows that the decree is against the Jews, and such a decree would have required his authority. Esther 3, 10 to 11. Again, the signet ring. Seal the document in order to authorize the decree. He understands that such a decree against the Jews would include Mordecai, the Jew, whom he had honored before the people. Esther 6 and 10. And against his wife, Queen Esther, who he just learned was a Jew. In Esther 7, 3 to 4. He probably felt used. The text doesn't say, but I imagine he felt pretty used. Did the king ask the enemy in sincerity? Did he ask about the name of the enemy, location of the enemy in sincerity? He may have made the connections and now knew that Esther spoke of Haman as the enemy. He might have. And in feigning his ignorance, he may have sought to shift any blame from himself. That may be the case. We're simply not told. But anyway, he hears what Esther said, and he's agitated. Who is he? Where is he? Who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing? It's hard to know exactly what the king was thinking, but all we know here is what the text says. Verse 6. And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. So Esther, the queen, points the blame squarely on Haman. Note that she did not blame the king, and it was probably a good thing to do. Well, not a good thing at all to do if she was to put the blame on him. So Esther puts the blame squarely on Haman. He's responsible. It's Haman who is the enemy. We see in Esther 7 and verse 4. He is the adversary. He is the foe. He's the adversary who turned against them. It is Haman who is wicked, who devised the wicked plot for their harm. We see that Haman was present at the banquet. As we mentioned before, he probably expected that the news was good for him. He thought that he would be honored in some way. We see the mind of the prideful man, Haman. But he was at the banquet, and he heard the petition of the queen, and now he heard the witness against him before the king. How did he feel? Well, we're told he was terrified. He was filled with terror. He was afraid. And he had reason to be afraid. Of course, knowing the history of King Ahasuerus. In verses 7 to 10, we see the wrath of the king against Haman. In verse 7, then the king arose in his wrath, from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And so the text says that the king arose in his wrath. This was not the only time that we remember his anger, like we see earlier in his reign as king, when Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. Esther chapter 1 and verse 12. This has been years ago. Of course, we have the benefit of the book, and we can look and we can see clearly what happened years ago. Here we see the anger, the wrath of the king. Well, the king got up. He probably got up from his couch. It doesn't say where he was sitting, but we noted earlier that there were couches on which to sit or to recline. So the king got up probably from his couch, and he left the place of the banquet of wine, and he walked into the palace garden. We note in Esther 7 and 8 that Esther was sitting on her couch. We learned that the couches were of gold and silver back in Esther chapter 1 and verse 6. Nothing less for the king. Remember when he showed off his wealth to those under him in the first chapter of the book? Well, now we read how Haman stood before Queen Esther and he begged for his life. He knew from experience that the king was thinking of having him killed. Haman saw that the king was determined. Did he have his mind made up? Well, things did not look good for Haman. Esther would not ask the king for mercy for Haman. Think about it. Think if Haman was given mercy, what problems he may cause later. But Esther did not speak up for Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Verse 8. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was sitting, where she was reclining. While at first he stood pleading for his life, verse 7. Now he had fallen before Queen Esther, pleading for mercy. I wonder where his mercy was as he plotted against the Jews for the sake of Mordecai, who he hated. Mordecai the Jew. Where was Haman's mercy? Well, here he's asking for mercy. He's pleading for his life. He knows that now only Queen Esther can save his life, pleading for him for mercy before the king. And as the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, he saw Haman across the couch with Esther. Talk about bad timing. We see this frequently in the Book of Esther. Again, we come back to the providence of God. Providence of God, him and his work behind the scenes. And while not explicitly stated, we see the hand of God, the providence of God. And in this passage here, King comes back and he sees that Haman has fallen across the couch. It appears he was down on his knees. He was prostrate before the queen. And the king comes out and sees him in this compromising position. And now he says, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" So the king said these words, and this was the king's order to arrest Haman. Well, why do I say that? Well, because as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Note they. Who does they refer to? They refers to the king's men, his servants, perhaps his eunuchs. And in this passage here, Haman earlier had his head covered. Remember how he had his head covered out of shame? Remember when he had to parade Mordecai around on the king's horse in the king's robe and proclaim his praise before the people? How embarrassed, how humiliated he felt. And so he went back to his house with his head covered in shame. However, in this passage, the covering of his head did not symbolize shame, but condemnation. It was a sign of him being condemned. It's doubtful that the king thought that Haman was actually threatening or attempting to inflict harm on Esther. Looking at the passage, I can't imagine that the king actually thought that Haman was assaulting the queen while the king was still in the house. Again, there were people standing nearby. I can't see it. So what does it mean? What then does it mean? Well, Haman was certainly in no position to assault, let alone rape, Esther, the queen, especially given that the two were, again, not alone. Again, look at Esther chapter 7, verse 9. The king may have alluded to how Esther had told the king that Haman had sold her and her people to be destroyed. Not as slaves, but sold to be destroyed. And so he might have been alluding to the words of Esther, how that the enemy had sold her people to be destroyed. And then she pointed out that Haman was the enemy. He's the enemy of the Jews. And now the king says, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? And so Esther had pointed out the evil of Haman against her people. And now he's seeing it for himself, or at least seeing Haman prostrate or across the couch before Esther. Again, I don't think that he thought that she was actually being assaulted, but I think that this was his way of condemning the man. Again, like we saw earlier, Haman knew that he had determined evil against him. Anyway, Haman was right. He was right to think that the king had already determined to kill him. After Esther told him, the king went on out of the place, and then he returned, and he was ready. And so with these words were the order for the king's servants to take Haman. And so they covered his face. This term assault is a word meaning to subdue or to bring into subjection, such as subjecting someone to servitude, like we see in 2 Chronicles 28:10, Nehemiah 5:5, Jeremiah 34:11, Jeremiah 34:16. The idea of forcing or molesting. But again, like I say, in this case, in this particular context, the idea of assault. Would he also assault the queen? Again, I don't see how that he thought that he would actually assault the queen with all the men there and with him still in the house. But I think, again, this was just his order. This was his order. This was his word to cover Haman's face and have him killed. Let's go on. Verse 9. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. Here the text mentions a eunuch by the name of Harbona. Earlier in the ministry, or in his ministry, there was a eunuch, one of 7, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and his name was Harbona. Esther 1 and 10. Difference of spelling. Harbona spoke up, suggesting a means of satisfying the king's wrath. He called attention to the gallows which Haman had made for Mordecai. Esther 5 and 14. Harbona did not have much love for Haman, reminding the king how Mordecai gave information of the plot to kill the king. This was just one more reason for the king to be angry at Haman. In the case of the plot against the king, it was the king who ordered an inquiry made, an investigation. And with the conclusion of the inquiry, the investigation, the matter was confirmed, and the perpetrators were hanged on a gallows. Esther 2 and 23. However, in this case, in Esther 7 and verse 9, there was no inquiry. There's no investigation. The king simply ordered Harbona, hang him on it. So again, Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, certainly did not have much love for Haman. He shouted out to the king, look, he pointed out the gallows. And apparently they could see the gallows from where they were. He pointed out the very gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai. 50 cubits high. Certainly visible to all, many to see. And so the king said to Harbona, hang him on it, hang him on the gallows that he made for Mordecai. Again, the gallows were made 50 cubits high. That's about 75 feet high. That is, if each cubit is about 18 inches. Remember that 50 cubits high was the height suggested by Haman's wife, Zeresh, and his friends, the wise men, in Esther 5 and verse 14. Think about how all these things are coming back on Haman. It's often that way in life. Here in verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Last verse of the chapter. We see here that the king's eunuchs hanged Haman on the gallows. The author of the book points out that these were the same gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Remember, Haman had planned to suggest to the king that he hang Mordecai on the gallows in Esther chapter 6 and 4. However, the plans of Haman were hindered when the king obliged him to honor Mordecai in Esther 6 and verse 6. Remember how he paraded him about the city? What agony that must have been for Haman, proud Haman. After Haman was hanged on the gallows, the wrath of the king subsided. He was hanged on his own gallows. There's a few passages I would like to end with today from other Old Testament scriptures. For example, in Numbers 32 and 23. Numbers 32 and 23, the scripture reads, be sure your sin will find you out. Be sure your sin will find you out. It sure found Haman out. The book of Proverbs, the wisdom of Solomon, Proverbs 26:27. Proverbs 26:27. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. Now, Haman did not use a stone. Haman had a gallows made. But the point's the same. In this case, while he didn't dig a pit or he didn't roll a stone, he had a gallows made, and he ended up getting hanged on those same gallows. Another thought, another passage, Psalm 7, 15 to 16. Psalm 7, 15 to 16. He made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return on his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. I think, too, of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, how that he taught that we reap what we sow. Of course, we could list any number of passages dealing with this point, but certainly Haman was reaping what he had sowed. And so we see the dreadful end of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. At first, he simply wanted Mordecai to bow down to him. When he wouldn't do it, he took it out on Mordecai's people. He tried. But ultimately, this end was his end. And we see that he was hanged on the gallows. Now, Lord willing, next time we'll continue with our study. We hope to see you then. If you are able, we look forward to the next time that we have to be together again in Esther chapter 8. Until next time, we encourage you to continue to study on your own, just as we study through the book of Esther. Thank you again.